Democrats in Congress are gearing up to work with President-elect Trump. One Democratic senator meeting with Mr. Trump yesterday in Trump Tower. So let's bring him in. That is Senator Coons. He is also a leading Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which will hold the confirmation hearings for Secretary of State nominee Rex Tillerson. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Allison.
So you went over to Trump Tower to visit with Mr. Trump to talk to him about the National Prayer Breakfast and officially invite him. How did your meeting and conversation go?
It was a relatively brief and very positive meeting. Senator John Bozeman, Republican of Arkansas, and I went as the bipartisan co-chairs of the 2017 National Prayer Breakfast. And our goal really was to explain to him the long history of this big national event where we have representatives from more than 70 countries around the world. More than 3,000 people come and attend this breakfast. It is a nonpartisan, non-sectarian, inclusive breakfast where, frankly, we pray for our country and its leaders, and we reflect on the year ahead. We typically have an inspiring keynote speaker and an address from the president. Mr. Trump was very gracious and welcoming, and it was generally a positive conversation.
So I assume he said yes, that he will go to the National Prayer Breakfast. Yes?
He expressed very strong interest. He'll get back to us on a specific commitment, but it seemed nearly certain that he would come and that he would continue this long-standing bipartisan tradition.
So, Senator, what were your impressions of the president-elect? And the reason that I ask is because you were quite vocal during the campaign. I'll just remind people of what you said about him then. You famously called him, quote, a thin-skinned reality TV star and a Cheeto-faced, short-fingered vulgarian.
Yeah, I regret the sharpness of some of those comments. He didn't bring that up. I didn't bring it up. We frankly had a conversation about the National Prayer Breakfast. There's a lot of other things I would have brought up if this were a partisan meeting. I would have demanded that he release his taxes and urged him to hold the press conference that was scheduled for today to talk about how he's going to address his conflict of interest. But the point of the prayer breakfast every Wednesday morning in the Senate is that we don't talk partisan politics. We get to know each other as people, and we reflect on our common interests. It's frankly pretty tough, Allison, to throw a punch at somebody on the floor of the Senate if you've held hands with them in prayer in the morning. And some of my best relationships in the Senate come from the prayer breakfast. And I regret some of the sharpness of the comments you just repeated that I made in the height of the campaign. But that doesn't mean that I'll step back from raising legitimate questions about his nominees, whether it's the complicating relationship with Vladimir Putin and Rex Tillerson, or my real concerns about Scott Pruitt, who's been nominated to head the EPA.
I want to ask you about the Rex Tillerson nomination because you are on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that will be holding the hearings. So what are your questions about Rex Tillerson? What are your reservations? And do you think it's possible that he will not be confirmed?
Well, my questions about Rex Tillerson's close and long relationship with Vladimir Putin and with Russia really derive from the fact that we don't know enough about President-elect Trump's relationships with Russia. He's the only president-elect in the modern era who hasn't released his taxes, so we don't know whether Russian oligarchs have invested in his development properties around the world to the tunes of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't know to whom he owes anything. And that's an important piece of transparency before the Electoral College meets. For Rex Tillerson, I'm simply going to ask whether he's clear about the difference between being the CEO of a big oil company, where your goal is return for shareholders, and being Secretary of State, where you have to fight for human rights, for a free press, and for democracy. Vladimir Putin's record makes it clear. He's murdered journalists. He's made his political opponents disappear. He's invaded neighboring countries. And there is real bipartisan concern about this, particularly when John Bolton, an unreconstructed neocon who still thinks the Iraq War was a great idea, is supposedly going to be nominated to be his deputy secretary.
There is a little bit of bipartisan concern. In fact, we've heard some of your Republican Senate colleagues talk about their concerns about ties to Russia. So do you think that it is possible that Rex Tillerson will not be confirmed?
Yes, I think it's quite possible. When you've got senators like Marco Rubio and John McCain raising real questions about Russia's actions to try and hack our election, calling for bipartisan hearings into the question of Russian influence on our elections, and then challenging Trump's view that Putin is someone with whom we can do business. If you nominate someone who's done business with Vladimir Putin for years, in fact has received a Medal of Friendship from Putin, I think we have legitimate, pointed questions about whether we should be cozying up to a strongman of a country that is our adversary, not our business partner.
Senator, I want to end on a very troubling note, and that is what's going on in Aleppo, Syria. This morning, it is catastrophic. It has been for months, but it seems to be at a real tipping point. Civilians are caught in Aleppo. They're trying to be evacuated. They're trying to escape. They're sending goodbye messages via social media. I know that you have been a vocal critic of President Obama's policy, or lack thereof, as I think you would say, on Syria. What can the U.S. do today?
Well, we are the largest humanitarian contributor to provide relief for refugees and support for their humanitarian needs. But frankly, the ongoing suffering in Syria is tragic. And while I understand that President Obama and Secretary Kerry confronted a very complex situation, and there was a real risk of our getting pulled in further, I think we need to be more actively engaged. We are actively engaged in fighting ISIS now. There is an ongoing assault against Mosul and soon Raqqa. And the American military is now much more actively engaged in the fight against ISIS. But I think we need to hold firm against Assad. He's committed crimes against humanity, and the Russians and the Iranians have actively participated now for years in the torture, in the murder of thousands of civilians, in just unspeakable crimes against people on the ground, innocent Syrians. And I think we can and should do more for Syrian refugees to make sure that we're part of the solution to this tragic situation in Syria.
Senator Chris Coons, thanks so much for being on New Day.
Thank you,
Chris.